The Vosper's Boat. By Jill Eggleton. Illustrations by Val Biro. Mr. and Mrs. Vosper were driving in the country. They saw a boat on the side of the road. The boat had a sign on it. The sign read, "Boat for sale, $10. We could go fishing in this boat," said Mr. Vosper. "We could catch fish and cook fish and chips for dinner," said Mrs. Vosper. So Mr. and Mrs. Vosper bought the boat and took it home. Mr. Vosper fixed the holes. Mrs. Vosper painted the boat. They sang as they worked, "We'll go fishing, fishing, fishing. We'll go fishing in the sea. We'll go fishing, fishing, fishing. Fish and chips for you and me." Mr. and Mrs. Vosper put the boat on the trailer. They sang as they drove, "We'll go fishing, fishing, fishing. We'll go fishing in the sea. We'll go fishing, fishing, fishing. Fish and chips for you and me." The boat went bump, bump on the trailer, but Mr. and Mrs. Vosper didn't hear. Mr. and Mrs. Vosper went around corners and up and down hills. They sang louder and louder. The boat went bump, bump, bump off the trailer and onto the road, but Mr. and Mrs. Vosper didn't hear. Mr. and Mrs. Vosper came to the sea. They got out the fishing lines and the box for the fish. "Now we will get the boat in the water," said Mr. Vosper. But when Mr. Vosper went to get the boat, it was not on the trailer. "What?" said Mr. Vosper. "Where is the boat?" "Oh no," said Mrs. Vosper. "Where is the boat?" Mr. and Mrs. Vosper went back along the road, looking for the boat. "Look," said Mrs. Vosper. "There is the boat." "That was the boat," said Mr. Vosper. "Now it is just a pile of wood." "What can I do with a pile of wood?" Mrs. Vosper smiled. She made a sign and she put it by the pile of wood. The sign said, "Wood for sale." A man came along the road. He stopped by the pile of wood. "I want some wood," he said. "I will give you $20 for this wood." Mr. and Mrs. Vosper smiled. "Good," said Mr. Vosper. "Good," said Mrs. Vosper, and she put the money in her purse. Mr. and Mrs. Vosper drove down the road. They laughed and laughed and laughed. They went to the fish and chip restaurant, and they had a big plate of fish and chips for dinner. "We don't need a boat," said Mr. and Mrs. Vosper, "to have fish and chips for dinner."